from the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
I think their militaries they get acculturated to a particular system or tradition. So I think it's an idea that we've always been preeminent. We have a particular, in our sphere of influence, our militaries have been predominant, kind of like the United States.
This is your host, Scot Bertram, and that's Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, the Wayne and Marcia Buske Distinguished Fellow in History at Hillsdale College, a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and author of many books, including the brand new one, The End of Everything, How Wars Descend into Annihilation. You can find that book at hillsdale.edu/podcast. Dr. Hanson, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
This new book, The End of Everything, 4 case studies of civilizations that collapsed, and collapsed might not be going far enough. These are civilizations that quite literally were wiped off the face of the earth. When exactly, and this is a question the book answers, when exactly is a people defined as vanquished or ended? Or in other words, how did you come to pick these 4 civilizations as case studies?
Well, there were more, but I thought these would be the most iconic. It's the destruction of most of the people, and in the modern period, we don't enslave people, although we do worse things to them sometimes. But it's the destruction of the population. That means the killing of them, or the enslavement of them, and the dispersion so that they're no longer a collective identity. And then the destruction of the language, which is scattered or no longer has a whole. There's no longer a literature or accounting system. There's no longer a central urban center, and there's no longer a culture. So in all of these, you could say that within 30 years after the destruction of their cities, there was no more Theban dialect of the ocean. There was no more Thebans. There was no more Carthaginians. They ceased to exist. The people who survived the city were enslaved. There was no Punic culture in North Africa. Mm-hmm. Constantinople is a little different. They used the infrastructure almost by changing the DNA, so to speak, that is the Ottomans. But within 30 years, there was no Greek, Hellenic, Christian culture as an entity. There was people scattered all around, went to the mountains, but most of them were killed off, enslaved, or converted. And then the same thing with the Aztecs. After Cortez destroyed Tenochtitlan and unleashed his allies, the Tlaxcalans, most of the Mexicas, what they called themselves, were extinguished. There are people that went up in the hills or that integrated and were assimilated and intermarried, but there was no longer a coherent Aztec civilization. It was gone.
The 4 case studies, as you allude to, Thebes, Punic Carthage, Constantinople, and the Aztecs, and I hope to spend just a few minutes on each and maybe get to some larger themes. There is so much great information in the book about how all of these occurred. This first case study on Thebes, before the assault takes place, you talk about Alexander, who waits 3 days outside the walls in hopes that the sheer spectacle, the size of forces, would erode the morale and force a submission. In most cases, is there that opportunity to stand down before these civilizations are destroyed?
Yeah, in almost every case there was. And part of the problem that led to these annihilations is that the defenders, the targets, had been majestic civilizations in the past, and often they had been reduced down to their capital city, but the walls were enormous, of 7-gated Thebes, the Great Walls, 22 miles of walls at Carthage that had never been broached, and the land wall at Constantinople, the Thebesian wall, had never been broached. So they had this confidence that no matter how much the odds were against them, 30 to 35,000 Macedonians versus probably no more than 10,000 combatants at Thebes. And they still felt that either their walls were so indomitable that Alexander couldn't take them, or that he wouldn't take them. They'd heard about the annihilations of Olympus and other cities, but they just didn't think he would do this to the most iconic city, home of the myth of Oedipus and Antigone, the great general Epaminondas. It was really the sort of the museum of all the Greek city-states. And he deliberately targeted that one that revolted first. Everybody looked toward Thebes because at this point in Greek history, it was the spiritual or the idealistic center of all the city-states.
This army in Thebes had been routed just 3 years prior, if I read correctly, but they attribute that to chance or to bad luck or to some unfortunate blunders, not realizing their fate would be the same in this war. Why do you think it is so hard for these civilizations and perhaps for more modern countries, more modern armies to admit shortcomings, to face reality?
I think their militaries they get acculturated to a particular system or tradition. And when they encounter something very radical, like in this case, the Macedonian phalanx that had sarissas or pikes that were 16 to 8 feet long and then integrated heavy cavalry, kind of a symphony of forces that the old one-dimensional phalanx did not. They didn't know quite what to do to it. They couldn't react. Mm-hmm. The same thing with the Carthaginians when they met on the ground the sophisticated Roman legions. And the same thing in the case of Constantinople. They didn't realize that all of the technology that they had that was superior to the Ottomans had been duplicated, replicated, Xeroxed by the Ottomans, and they had hired a number of Europeans. So they actually had much more, they had more numerous cannons and much bigger cannons to knock down the walls. And they had as good weapons as the Westerners inside the city. So I think it's an idea that we've always been preeminent. We have a particular, in our sphere of influence, our militaries have been predominant. Kind of like the United States. I mean, if people were to say to us, there's no way you can stop the Chinese coming in from Taiwan, we would say, well, we have aircraft carriers, and we were preeminent for 80 years. Mm-hmm. This is just, but rather than say, okay, that may be true, we need to match ship for ship. They're outbilling us 5 ships to 1. But nations don't seem to do that. They get complacent.
Dr. Victor Davis Hanson with us, the new book, The End of Everything, How Wars Descend into Annihilation. This second case study on Punic Carthage. It turns on the arrival of one man on the scene, Scipio. And to skip ahead just briefly, Constantinople, that chapter 2, the wounding of one man has a big influence on what happens. How often do we see that through these wars, through time, that the importance of quite literally a single man can be somewhat determinative in the outcome?
Yeah, it's very determinant. I think if Alexander the Great wasn't there, and he wasn't the great there, he was only 21 years old. Mm-hmm. He wouldn't really get into Europe until he was 23. Into Persia. And no one knew who he was, really. They'd seen him at Chaeronea, but there were so many claimants for the throne after his father was assassinated the year before that they either didn't believe he was very good, or that he was too young, or that he had been assassinated. So they had no idea of the innate genius and ruthlessness that he possessed. So when he came up to the walls and he warned them that finally he was going to annihilate the city, they didn't believe him. And they didn't believe he could. The Roman siege of Carthage was stalled, and they had this legate, the adopted grandson of the famous Scipio Africanus. But actually, he was from the family of Aemilius Paulus, who was even more noted than the Scipios, that is, Scipio Aemilianus. And so he rose through the ranks very quickly after the failures of the first 2 years of the siege. And the Carthaginians were not aware of who he was or what his abilities were or what he had done in Spain. And without him, I don't think they would have taken the city. And the same thing is true in some regards of the Byzantines had dealt with a lot of emperors, and they could always cajole them or buy them off, mm-hmm. or appeal to their reason that said, we have Venetians and Genovese concessions here in the city. This is your window to the west. This is how you get your gunpowder. This is how you get your bronze cannon. It wouldn't be in your interest. And Mehmet, who was 21 years old, had staked his entire sultanship on destroying Constantinople. And they tried to bribe him. They tried to reason with him. And he came within about a week of losing that battle. But if he had not been the Sultan, and most of his advisors told him to quit. You can't take the Theodosian walls, just leave. And they had lost over 40 or 50,000 soldiers, but he persevered. And it's very clear that Mexico City probably would have been taken, Tenochtitlan, by someone, but it wouldn't have been taken in 1519 to 1521 without Hernan Cortez. He was an authentic military genius, and he was a very obscure guy when he went into Mexico. He was just a low-ranking bureaucrat from Cuba, but he was from all of our first-hand sources, he was just a frightening genius, and he would not quit.
We'll continue our conversation with Victor Davis Hanson next. You can find the brand new book, The End of Everything, at hillsdale.edu/podcast. Additionally, we invite you to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network and all the audio from Hillsdale College. That includes the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, Hillsdale Dialogues, Imprimis, Hillsdale College's Online Courses Podcast, The Larry Arnn Show, and more. Find all those shows wherever you get your audio. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. In the second case study in Rome and Carthage, you say that there is an eternal lesson that accusations of war, guilt, and harsh reparations can ensure another war, but with the insulted newly resurgent. How often do we see this repeated through history? Where do we see some perhaps more prominent examples?
Well, there's kind of a triad, and by that I mean the Germans invade France in 1870, and 70-71, they invade Belgium and France in 1914. They invade France in 1940 and the Low Countries. And then that's it. That aggression is finally ended. It's very eerie how it's three stages, like the first, second, and third Punic War, where the victor finally says no more and tries to. And we didn't quite annihilate German civilization, but as I mentioned in the book, Henry Morgenthau had a Morgenthau plan to really do that, to scatter Germans all over Eastern Europe and make it a pastoral economy and destroy the rural, but that was not approved. And you see in there's a first Peloponnesian War, and there's a second as well, but there's not a third. And I guess what happens is, after a repetition of the same existential problem, the victor finally says, I don't really care about the merits of what's going on. I just want to eliminate this problem. You've seen it in the Middle East, too, with these 7 or 8 serial wars. And people in Israel are now saying things like, we can't live with Hamas. It's been too much. It will never end. And I think the people who drove the extension of Carthage came from popular support in Rome. The elder Cato, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, that he supposedly finished every speech. He had enormous public support, and the public went wild on news that the city had surrendered. And then they sent inspectors over, to Tunisia to make sure that the city was not just defeated, but wiped out and destroyed.
Dr. Victor Davis Hanson with us. The End of Everything is the book, How Wars Descend into Annihilation. The fourth case study on the Aztecs. You read this chapter, Dr. Hanson, and I think the question that keeps coming to my mind is, how did this happen, this modest size of forces? How does this small group under Cortez end a civilization?
Well, there's 2 or 3 reasons. First of all, these were not the Pilgrims. These were not North American settlers in the New World. They came with their families, and they were Puritans or religious refugees. These were emissaries of the Spanish Empire at its greatest height under Charles V, and they had been fighting Muslims for 200 years on the Reconquista, which they had just won just 30 years earlier. And they had been fighting Muslims all through North Africa, and they had been now fighting Protestant armies. So the people that Cortez brought, altogether, there may have been 2,500, but at one time, there was never more than 1,500. They were the greatest individual soldiers in Europe and the most battle. Every one of them, Pedro Alvarado or any of those people that accompanied them, had been veterans of long wars. They had some of the best equipment and formations in Europe. They had Toledo steel. They had best horses in Europe. They had something called a tercio. It's a kind of like a later version of the phalanx. They had arquebuses. So technology-wise, their equipment was just so superior to people in Europe, but especially people in the New World. An obsidian blade was as sharp, but only maybe for one or two blows, and especially against Spanish steel breastplates. But they had Toledo steel that would slice off a man's head with one blow. And then there was the bewilderment. The Aztecs had never seen anybody like this. So they thought they were gods. They had white skins. They thought that their horses were attached to the rider. They thought they were centaurs. They've never seen mastiffs before, these huge dogs. They thought they were dragons. They didn't quite know. There was some kind of exaggerated a little bit, and the Spanish played on it. Finally, they warmed up to the idea that they're not just men, but men who want to destroy us. But there was technology, there was a Spanish military tradition, and then there was Cortez's overweening desire to at first take over the city and then use it for his own purposes. But as the fighting over 2 years went on and got more brutal, and he started to see that this was sort of like an ancient Auschwitz where 25 to 30,000 people were human sacrificed each year to the anger of the subjugated Aztec imperial subjects. He was able, kind of with a tradition of Roman divide and conquer, to build a huge army of Tlaxcalans, mostly Tlaxcalans, but he had about 40 or 50,000 indigenous Indians that he appealed to their sense of revenge and plunder. And then he had a lot of missionaries with him. And the idea that this civilization engaged in things such as human sacrifice, cannibalism, sodomy, they felt that it had to be destroyed. And so then and like as I said in the book, all of them, once they destroyed these magnificent cities, they all cried crocodile tears and said they didn't mean to do it. Cortez said, I really didn't mean to do it. So did Scipio, so did Mehmet, so did Alexander.
At the end of the chapter on the Aztecs, you make the point that they held antithetical mentalities. Spanish and the Aztecs did not just hold different assumptions about the human condition, but were of mindsets unfathomable to one another, and in the end, wholly incompatible. Is this often the case in these great wars through time?
Yeah, I think so. It is. Alexander had an agenda that he wanted to conquer the Greek city-states, use their wealth and manpower and science, and then convince them to go to Persia and destroy this huge empire that had invaded Greece twice. And some of them bought the idea of a grand Hellenic crusade, even under a half-Hellenic leader. And the same thing was true with the Romans. Scipio was convincing his legionnaires that you could not let this maritime African Punic civilization continue because they were relentless. They had destroyed them. They felt their armies twice. Here it was the third Punic War, and guess what? There were 500,000 people in the city. It was wealthy. They had a huge military again. Even though they didn't pose a threat, they said they weren't, and I don't think they did. I think they were sincere. They didn't want a war with Rome. But it was the idea that they're completely antithetical to us. They're Punic. They have a different language. They're Semitic people, and they are a rival for the control of the Western Mediterranean. I don't think there was any reconciliation between the Spanish and the Aztecs. Remember, it was very different than the North American experience where people from all over Europe could come into the English and French colonies. In the Spanish imperial system, you were not allowed to come in unless you were Catholic and had permission of the Spanish crown, which meant you couldn't come in. And they were almost all male. In fact, the few women that accompanied Cortez were conquistadores themselves. And so these people were not coming with families to have small farms. They were coming for gold, glory, and God, to convert souls, to get more, I guess, more numbers in the war against Protestantism and Islam, but also to get huge imperial estates with slave labor and become rich. Most of them were hidalgos, or the upper or middle class from Castile. Mm-hmm. And they were known as the most accomplished fighters, and they were pretty well educated, but they were not the aristocracy, and they were shut out. And that fact allowed them to have great opportunities in the New World. And so the New World was basically created by Castilians in the case of Latin America.
We'll continue with Victor Davis Hanson in just a moment, talking about his new book, The End of Everything, which you can find at hillsdale.edu/podcast. That's hillsdale.edu/podcast to find Dr. Hanson's new book. In the meantime, right now is a perfect time to sign up for Hillsdale's brand new online course, The History of Classical Music. Classical music is one of the greatest achievements of Western civilization, but I understand it can be intimidating. But in the new online course, you'll learn how to appreciate humanity's greatest musical accomplishments. It's the history of classical music, Pythagoras through Beethoven, and it's absolutely free, no charge to you. Your teacher is Hyperion Knight, concert pianist and Hillsdale College Distinguished Fellow. He'll explain how music has developed and what distinguishes the greatest musical achievements. The History of Classical Music, Pythagoras through Beethoven. Sign up now at hillsdale.edu/new course. NEWCOURSE. That's hillsdale.edu/new course for the History of Classical Music, the brand new free online course from Hillsdale College. We continue now with Victor Davis Hanson, author of the new book, The End of Everything. Dr. Hanson, that secondary question there, how wars descend into annihilation, what do you gather from these 4 case studies? What's the common thread that changed these from mere battles into something that ends, again, in the annihilation, the collapse of a certain civilization?
I don't think that the defenders, as I said earlier, they don't understand the nature of the existential enemy outside their walls, or what their agendas are, or what their capabilities are, since they have had some, except for the Aztecs, some exposure to them. And they have been pretty successful in surviving. And they don't make a rational comparison between their resources and the resources of the enemy, or the intent of the enemy. So they're still negotiating with Scipio, and they have no idea what he wants to do. The same thing with Alexander, the same thing with Mehmet. You can't negotiate with these people. They have an agenda it's in their agenda to destroy them. They don't understand that these attacking societies are on the ascendance, and their societies are running on fumes of past reputation and glory. So there was only 7,000 people on the walls of Constantinople that were willing to fight, maybe 50,000 in the city. This city had 1 million people under Justinian 1,000 years early, just in the 13th century. Even after the Fourth Crusade sack, it probably had 700,000. So they're sort of like Britain today, where they have the pomp and the glory, but they're not major military powers or economic powerhouses the way that they were, and yet they feel they are. And then they put too much trust in the defensive, just because they have a system of centuries-old defenses. In the case of Tenochtitlan, they had a very elaborate, the city was on a lake, and they had locks that they could flood areas and causeways they could cut off. And no one had ever been able to get into the city once they prohibited that. But they didn't understand that they'd never met people like the Spanish that they built out of scratch sloops or brigantines and had an amphibious attack. And so they were much more vulnerable than they thought. And then they thought that they could negotiate away their defeat. In other words, they could maybe survive intact. And that was not on the agenda of any of these conquerors. So there's a naivete or a suspension of belief.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a reactionary appeal. They think allies they always think allies are coming. The
Yes.
Spartans and the Athenians they're down at the Isthmus, the Spartans. The Athenians are going to come any day and help us. Or the Carthaginians say the Macedonians will attack the Romans from the rear in the Balkans. Or they looked at the walls, they could see the Dardanelles out, and they said they're going to come up the Hellespont any day. The Venetians, the Genovese, they had small contingents, but they thought a huge army of Christendom would be transported and hit the Ottomans from the rear. And of course, the Aztecs kept thinking that they could appeal to their ally and break. They did finally break. They almost killed Cortez at the Noche Triste, but the one great victory where they rid themselves of the Spanish for about 6 months, but 9 months. But they didn't have a realistic appraisal of the capability of the enemy or their intentions. And I think that's kind of a warning today that people tend to discount. In the epilogue, I kind of reviewed a few places that were very naive about when we should take more seriously the people's threat to destroy countries and their neighborhoods. We have a lot of them in the contemporary world today.
Yeah. The End of Everything is the new book by Victor Davis Hanson. One final question on that topic, which is this: the epilogue does get into the lessons that we can learn and how we can perhaps apply them for today. We are told that humanity is becoming more uniform, that we are becoming more interconnected. But you say that the world, too, is growing increasingly vulnerable and dangerous. Why is our modern world not immune from repeating tragedies like these of the past?
Yeah, it's not. Human nature is pretty static, and the methods of destruction, whether it's bio or artificial intelligence or chemical or nuclear, are far advanced in the ancient world. So it's much easier to wipe a country out. And I think this global idea of a global governance, it's kind of like we're back to the League of Nations idea that we're going to let somebody else or collective wisdom will stop renegade terrorists or murderers. But if you look at the area around Turkey especially, and Mr. Erdogan, people kind of laugh him off, but he has said to the Greeks, you're going to wake up one day and you're going to have a sky full of missiles. He's overflying Greek islands that he says are Turkish. He says he's the new Ottoman empire. He says that our nuclear weapons at Isilark really belong to him and he won't let us take them out. He's told the Armenians he has a solution for them, as he did in Karabakh just this year, where he ethnically cleansed 200,000 and rid them out of Azerbaijan. They'd been there for 500 years. And he said, we have the same solution as our grandparents. We know what the Iranians have said to Israel, that it's a one-bomb state, and the idea that half the world's Jews and probably 90% of the world's observant Jews are all in one place makes the Iranian agenda pretty easy. And yet we discount that. We said Putin has said that Ukraine is a historical misnomer. It doesn't exist anymore. It can be absorbed by Russia. The language is properly to be Russian. It's capable of using tactical nuclear weapons. And I think I counted 19. A final thing is I had just a sentence about the threats that Chinese generals and politicians have made to Taiwan, that it was an illegitimate mistake and it will be absorbed back into China. It won't be a Taiwanese dialect or industry. And the Chinese government, I've usually had pretty good luck with China, really good luck, especially my World War II book, because they felt that it was, they were an ally of the United States in World War II, and anything that made the Japanese look barbaric, they wanted to buy and translate and sell. But they wrote us a letter, the publisher of my agent said, you have to take that line out, that we want to destroy Taiwan or we're going to cancel the contract. And I said, I wouldn't do it. So they did cancel the contract, and there was no Chinese edition of the book. But it shows you that they're very sensitive to that. Because, in fact, I sent back to them I only had one or two references to it. I think one actually, and I sent back, I found 17 where a Chinese general, political commissar, member of the inner circle, had said that they were going to nuke Taiwan or nuke Japan or land on Taiwan and kill everybody. It was pretty amazing. So I just sent them the links back. And I never heard back from them.
Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, the new book is The End of Everything, How Wars Descend into Annihilation. He is Wayne and Marcia Buske, Distinguished Fellow in History at Hillsdale College, also Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. And again, the new book, The End of Everything. Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you for having me again.
Up next, we talk with Mark McClay from Hillsdale's Classics Department. He'll tell us about his recent book on the Bacchic gold tablets from the ancient Greek world. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Payne. At the K-12 Education Office at Hillsdale College, we support school founding groups and their efforts to start classical schools across the country. Finding the right leader is one of the first and most important steps to building a successful school. While we do consider experience in education, we seek candidates who exhibit unwavering personal integrity, honesty, courage, and servant-hearted leadership. Perhaps that's you. If you're looking to engage in fulfilling, impactful, and challenging work protecting our nation's future and building up the next generation of virtuous citizens, we'd love to hear from you. I'm looking for strong school leaders right now. Learn more about how you can make a difference at hillsdale.edu/leader. hillsdale.edu/LEADER. That's hillsdale.edu/leader.
We're back on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. We're joined by Dr. Mark McClay, Assistant Professor of Classics at Hillsdale College. Dr. McClay, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Talking today about some of your research and a recent book. That book is called The Bacchic Gold Tablets and Poetic Tradition. So I'm not sure how much our listeners know about this, but that's why you're here to fill them in. The historic significance of these Bacchic gold tablets. Tell us, obviously, first a little about what they are, some background so people can know, and how do they fit into the broader context of what we know about ancient Greek religious practices?
Yeah, those are all, that's what the book's about. Those are all good questions. So the Bacchic tablets that are mentioned in the title of the book are a collection of 30-something very small pieces of gold, sort of gold strips that are found in tombs mostly. They were all originally in tombs, but some of them we find them in they've already been removed from the tombs, and they're all inscribed with texts, short texts that are predominantly in verse. They're not always. And they give a mixture of directions to the deceased. Sometimes give them directions to the underworld, or sometimes contain promises of a happy afterlife phrased in various ways. So there's a lot of debate about historically, these first started coming to light in the 1870s, and there's a lot of debate about how exactly they do fit into the religious practices of the ancient Greek world. So they're all from the oldest ones are from about the time of Plato, from about 400 BC, and so from about the time of Plato and Socrates. The debate about them generally deals with how much do they come from a distinctive religious practice that's different from what you might call the mainstream of Greek religion. How much do they represent a sort of an unusual set of beliefs about the afterlife, or an unusual set of practices, or how much are they kind of in continuity with the quote-unquote mainstream?
You comment in the book that one of the interesting themes within the gold tablets is the promise of salvation. How unique of a theory is that within the ancient Greek spiritual tradition?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I kind of hesitate a bit about using the word salvation because it sounds as a risk of importing a lot of kind of Christian presuppositions. But sometimes it's the best I can do to kind of convey quickly. part, I guess, what do we mean by salvation generally is if there is a concept of salvation in the gold tablets, it's definitely going to be different from what we mean in Christian vocabulary. Sure. I would say that it means, first of all, the idea of a differentiated status in the afterlife. There are a lot of different ways that the afterlife gets portrayed in antiquity. Sometimes it gets portrayed as just a kind of drab uniformity. So in Homer's Hades is that way, that the souls of the dead are just these kind of memory images that don't really have any kind of liveliness. There are also other traditions where certain heroes get taken to the Isles of the Blessed or to Elysium, and they seem to have some kind of happy existence. There are also instances where certain extraordinary evildoers are subject to punishment. Mm-hmm. So like even in Homer, like Sisyphus is rolling the stone and Tantalus can't drink the water and all that. So what we find in the tablets is a kind of extension of that idea where there are kind of multiple possibilities. And the deceased, who seem to be mystery initiates, seem to be offered a way of achieving a particular possibility. I think actually if I could read a text of one
Certainly,
of them,
yes.
That might be the way the best way to illustrate this. So this is from the longest of the kind of the complete text that survives. It's from a woman's grave in southern Italy. And I'll just read, it goes as follows. It says, you'll go into the well-built house of Hades. There is a spring on the right, and standing beside it, a white cypress. There, the souls of the dead come down and refresh themselves. Do not even go near that stream. Further on, you will find from the lake of memory cool water flowing forth, but there are guardians above it, and they will question you with prudent wisdom, asking what you seek in the gloomy darkness of Hades. Say, quote, I am a child of earth and starry heaven, and I am parched with thirst and dying, but quickly grant for me to drink cool water from the lake of memory. And they will announce you to the king of the underworld, and they will grant for you to drink from the lake of memory. And when you have drunk, you shall go along the sacred road which other famed initiates and Bacchants tread. So that is a collection of a lot of traditional motifs. So the motif of a spring that you drink from in the underworld, the idea that the dead are thirsty is a really common folklore motif. The idea of multiple paths in the underworld is also kind of a common motif. And so, but also there's this idea of differentiation, that there's this kind of obvious stream that you'll see all the other souls drinking at. You don't want to drink at that stream. You want to go further on. It's sort of, it's like kind of tourist guides that warn you not to go to the expensive restaurant that's right on the piazza where the food's not very good. But if you go down this alley, there's a little bistro that's really good. And so there's a lot of this that's subject to different interpretations. What the details mean. What does it mean? Say, I'm a child of earth and heaven, and all that. What exactly is the lake of memory? But the object is to achieve a kind of an afterlife that is distinct from what the sort of anonymous masses get.
Are a lot of them instructional in that way?
Some of them are, and actually, there's 13 tablets that have some version of that particular text, and they're kind of widely distributed, which is interesting. They're I mentioned this one. This one's from southern Italy. There are a few of them from southern Italy and Sicily. There's some from Crete. One of them is from Thessaly in the Greek mainland. So, and those are fairly close in time. So it means that this must have been going on kind of simultaneously in a bunch of different places. There are others that are sort of more affirmational. So this is another one also from southern Italy in a different site. Now this one is spoken in the first person. It's the deceased talking. So I'll just read this one. I come pure from the pure, queen of those below the earth. So he seems to be talking to Persephone, who's the goddess of the underworld, the bride of Hades. I come pure from the pure, queen of those below the earth, Eucles, Eubulius, and other immortal gods. For I boast that I too am of your blessed lineage. But fate, Moira, overcame me, and the other immortal gods overcame me, and the star-flinger with lightning. And I flew out of the grievous heavy circle, and I came to the desired crown with swift feet. And I went beneath the breast of the lady, the underworld queen, and I came to the desired crown with swift feet. Happy and blessed one, you shall be a god instead of a mortal. A kid I fell into milk. that last line is a bit of a head scratcher. But actually, there are quite a lot of head scratchers in that whole thing. So, but again, it seems to be a sort of, he says, I boast that I too am of your blessed lineage, addressing a company of a kind of court of underworld divinities. We're not quite sure who Eucles and Eubulius are, but those seem to be kind of code names perhaps for Hades and Dionysus. But claiming that he has a place in their company is what he's asserting, even though again, the meaning of all the details of what these boasts. What does it mean? He says, "I flew out of the heavy circle. I came to the desired crown. I went beneath the breast of the underworld queen." Whatever their specific meaning, they're claiming some kind of special status in the afterlife.
Talking with Dr. Mark McClay here at Hillsdale College, his book, The Bacchic Gold Tablets and Poetic Tradition. What do those poetic elements in the tablets perhaps contribute to our understanding about ancient Greek poetry, ancient Greek mythology?
Yeah, that's in some ways what the book is trying to get at, that in addition, or maybe in some ways pushing back against the tendency to interpret the tablets as belonging to this very unusual, we'll say, belief system. So and they clearly have some unusual ideas in them, but I think it's significant that they use a lot of traditional poetic diction. So the meter they use is dactylic hexameter, which is the same meter as the meter of epic. It's the same as the meter of the Homeric poems. Part of what I argue is that there's a lot of details that can be understood as extensions of ideas you find in more quote unquote traditional Greek poetry. So the idea that the meaning of the lake of memory is one. There's really not any consensus about what that means, and whether it's because memory, mnemosune in Greek, is also, if it has a capital M, it's also the goddess who's the mother of the muses, and so there's even debate about whether it's whether the water is somehow superintended by the goddess, or if it's just the memory of the thing. And so what I find helpful turning to the sort of poetic background is, what's the role of memory in Greek poetic tradition? Now, that itself is very complicated, but one of the functions it serves is it's the thing that signifies a kind of enduring life after someone dies. So there's social memory. If people remember or commemorate you after you've died, that's a kind of fame, kleos, that is really sought after in poetic tradition. And the word that's used to describe the Bacchants at that last line is the famed Bacchants. It's a kleos word. And also, so that's objective, you might say, social memory. And also subjective memory kind of signifies a continuity of life too. And so, and it particularly is often used to signify the coherence of a social group. So Greek poetry was always performed. A lot of contexts, it was performed by, say, in symposia or drinking party settings that were of sort of small or relatively small groups of people who thought of themselves as kind of differentiated from the common lot. And memory could kind of signify a continuity of the group. And so that's one thing I found hadn't really been investigated in these tablets, is there's all these this emphasis on being part of a special group. So in the end, in the first tablet I read, the soul makes its way through the underworld, and the end result is it gets incorporated into this sort of underworld procession. And so that's one example of how I'm trying to look to the poetic context. I see more of an engagement with traditional ideas.
Sure,
it's a very creative engagement with traditional ideas, but it's not purely a sort of separate belief system from what you find in other Greek sources.
You've written this book, and we trust you, of course. But are there discrepancies or variations in some of the interpretations among scholars for these tablets?
Oh, heavens, yes. I mean, just in the ones that I've read, I've kind of mentioned some of them, like what memory means, all that. There are, or the sort of larger question of what sort of belief system, if any, they kind of derive from or reflect. There are plenty of kind of cryptic phrases that are hard to find parallels for. The obvious one, I guess, is that line about the kid falling into milk, which actually shows up on 3 other tablets. And in 2 kind of widely separated locations. So it must have been around. There's also a variation where a bull I fell into milk, or a ram I fell into milk. So the initiate or the deceased kind of identifies him or herself with an animal and is falling or jumping into milk. And that has been just I think one scholar said something like there are no parallels. I think it was W.K.C. Guthrie, who was a great early 20th century scholar. So there are no parallels that shed light on this, and the speculations of scholars make for entertaining reading. So it's been suggested maybe the milk refers to the Milky Way. Maybe there's some kind of parallel with the Hebrew Bible about not cooking a goat in its mother's milk, which doesn't seem to explain much. I've actually ventured into the fray, and I argued that milk is used as a kinship symbol, signifying kinship with the gods. But again, that's only that's not a slam dunk. That's only a possibility to throw out there. So yeah, there are a lot of both big and small things on which we continue to have productive conversations. I'll put it that way. Yeah.
Dr. Mark McClay, he is Assistant Professor of Classics here at Hillsdale College, and his recent book, The Bacchic Gold Tablets and Poetic Tradition, which you can find available now. Dr. McClay, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you so much for having me.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Victor Davis Hanson. His brand new book is The End of Everything. Find it at hillsdale.edu/podcast. And also Dr. Mark McClay from Hillsdale's Classics Department. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.